You are about to witness the very exciting story of a city and its people. It will be an adventure that will open new sights in familiar surroundings. That city is Detroit. Yes, Detroit is enjoying its finest hour. There is a renaissance, a rebirth in the city.
In Detroit, big money in the pockets of small boys has the attention of federal investigators.
The kids work in teams, one collecting the money, another delivering the dope, others acting as lookouts, and all are decoys for one another. And when a lookout throws a signal, a busy street can become deserted in a matter of seconds. That way, a cruising police officer sees nothing. As a result, Young Boys Incorporated has expanded into Pontiac, where police say the group has been connected with at least one murder.
The most notorious drug trafficking ring in Detroit history. At its height, Young Boys Incorporated, as the gang was known, was grossing $100,000 a day.
If a motherfucker would ask them, damn, who got it? Them young boys got it. Because we was all little kids. Them young boys got it, so it just stuck.
When I was a young boy, growing up in the ghetto, hanging out on corners, singing with the fellas.
Butch Jones, aka Big Boy, was born in 1950s Detroit when the city was at its height of being the king of the auto industry. The black middle class was thriving in the city of Detroit, and the automobile factory jobs were booming. And Butch had a hard-working mom and dad as well, but he knew that it was 5 of them in a very small home, and some of the things that he wanted, they just couldn't afford. The leather jackets, gaiters, designer gym shoes, he couldn't put that on his mom and dad, so he decided to go out and get it himself. He started small time, just skipping school, just doing little mischievous acts, but over time, he started to rob taxi cab drivers. Eventually, he would begin to work for his brother-in-law, selling small amounts of heroin, just learning the game, and getting deeper into the street life. By the age of 16, he already had 2 murders, one while guarding a drug house. A man broke in and he hit him with a shotgun, killing him, and the other one was a paid hit. One day, a man that he knew from his neighborhood, that knew that he was trained to go, came to a young Butch Jones with a proposition, $20,000 for a hit. And when he heard the amount, Butch said, "You must want me to kill the president." But it was on a rival drug dealer who had moved into this guy's territory, and he wanted him gone. And when he told Butch the man he wanted hit, Butch knew that if he was gonna go at him, he better not miss, because this guy had a very fierce reputation. He studied the man for about 2 weeks, learning his habits and his routine. Something that he noticed is that the man would take the trash out every day at the same time, and this would be the perfect opportunity to catch him slipping. He hid in a dumpster with a shotgun, waiting for the moment that his victim would come outside and take the trash out, as he had did so many mornings before. But this morning would be his last. And as he opened his dumpster to take the trash out, it was a shotgun waiting for him. And according to Butch Jones, he made eye contact with the man, and he could tell by the look on his face that he knew he messed up, and it was over. On a hot summer day in 1973, Butch Jones was sitting on his porch, just chilling, and he was approached by a woman that he knew named Kathy, who was the sister of his right-hand man, Leroy, and she had just told him how she got robbed. And Butch wasn't gonna let this slide. So him, a few of his guys, and Kathy went over to a spot that they thought the dudes who robbed her would be at, some apartments right off of Richton and Hamilton. And when they knocked on the door, a woman answered, and they all just bust in, asking where the guys who robbed Kathy and where's the money. But the woman was telling them nobody's here. It was just her child, and another man who was sitting on the couch. Butch told his two homeboys that he had brought with him to go search the rooms for the money, and as they were searching, the man on the couch, he stood up. And according to Butch, he started to try to do all of these different karate moves on him. And Butch was telling him, yo man, back up. We just here to get the money and we gonna leave. We not here to hurt you. But the guy just kept coming at him with the karate moves. And eventually, Butch shot him in the leg to stop him. And when he shot him, one of the men that he brought with him came out of the room and just started stabbing the dude repeatedly. He tried to attack the mother and the child that was there as well, but Butch Jones wouldn't let him, and they got up out of there. The man who was stabbed in the apartment would later die from his wounds, and Butch and his crew would be apprehended and charged with murder. They were trying to give him life in prison, and it wasn't looking good. The only thing that saved him was the testimony of the young woman who was in the home with her child, who testified that Butch did save him when his accomplice tried to attack her and her kid with a knife. The charges would be reduced from murder to manslaughter, and Butch would be sentenced to 7 years in prison. But while Butch was away, something was happening in the streets of Detroit that would forever change the city, and it was happening right on Dexter. In late 1976, going into 77, a group of young kids would get together and form something legendary. Mark Block Marshall, Bernard Boykins, aka Bone Man, Reginald Chestnut, aka Nut, even though he went to jail as the crew was being formed, Chuck Lindsay, aka Choicey Chuck, Dwayne Davis, also known as WW or Wonderful Wayne, Raymond Peoples, also known as Baby Ray, would become an original member of the crew as well, after he came home from beating a murder charge that he had caught during the Illinois riots, and this gave him a lot of fame and notoriety around the city. Another member of the crew, who was more infamous than famous, was Mark Block Marshall, who was known for being a straight-up killer in the streets and for having a lot of money. But it's said that that money came from a very dark and bloody place, because on August 19th, 1974, 3 people would be found murdered in a home on LaSalle Street. Wallace Marshall, who was the father of Block Marshall, his stepmother Constance, and a nurse who was working in a home by the name of Patrice Williams. There was another woman who was found, barely clinging to life. Her name was Patrice Blunt, but she would later die at the hospital. Block Marshall would attempt to collect the life insurance money on his dad, but he would be stopped from doing that and charged with the murder of everyone in the home. He would be taken to trial multiple times, but each time he was found innocent. Eventually, he was able to get his hands on the life insurance money, and this is what helped finance the start of the gang. The first spot they had was a bar on the corner of Prairie and Puritan, selling heroin, but they were quickly able to expand. Their numbers couldn't be matched, and when they did show up on the block, it was probably gonna be theirs. They would drive a lot of the older drug dealers from the 60s and 70s out of business. The kids of this era were more violent, more ruthless, and they had the best product. Up until that point in the city, it had been mostly brown heroin, but the new kids moving heroin had that China white. And according to Brett, aka B Skeeter, a select few of the guys were taken over to Dr. Bombay's house, a man who specialized in cooking up heroin and making it extra potent. And word began to spread throughout the city that them young kids on the west side had the best heroin in town. Anytime somebody would come around looking to cop, they would ask a veteran addict, who should I get product from? Who got the best dope? And they would always tell them, you need to go see them young boys. Them young boys got it. In the beginning, there wasn't a name for the crew. It was just a bunch of young kids running wild in the streets of Detroit, trying to come up in the drug game. But as they continued their rise to power in the city of Detroit, they realized that they did need a name. And one day when 2 of the founding members, Chuck Lindsay and Wonderful Wayne, were walking down Dexter, they started throwing back and forth ideas for different names that represents their crew and what they stand for, but they wasn't liking what they was coming up with. And all of a sudden, as they were walking, Chuck Lindsey stopped in his tracks and said, "Hey man, what about them young boys? They never call us by our names anyways. They always calling us young boys." Wonderful Wayne liked the name too. He was like, "Yeah, them young boys. But you know what? Let's put Incorporated behind it because we about our business." And the Y.B.I. was born. In mid-1978, Butch Jones would be released from prison after serving 4.5 years of a 7-year sentence. And he wanted to join what the Y.B.I. had going on, even though some of the founding members didn't want him to be down. They knew he had a reputation for being ruthless, but he was good friends with Raymond Peoples and Block Marshall, and they wanted him to be down. So he was named as one of the top dogs of the Y.B.I.
Once it got started, it snowballed. It just kept growing and growing. And it's like people that know about Y.B.I., like they Y.B.I. to the day they die.
They would go on to control over 80% of the heroin trade in the city of Detroit, and when it came to expansion, they believed in doing it one way, by force. They had the Jeffries Projects, the Brewsters, Martindale and Elmhurst, John R. and Erskine, Monterey and Dexter. It was the young kids that were making it happen. It was the runners. They were rolling, and they would do it in style. Max Julian jackets, campaign hats with the top 10s. They would spend a lot of time hanging out on Martindale, where you could see flashy cars going up and down the street. They loved Cadillacs, Benzes, and especially Corvettes. They were superstars everywhere that they would go, and some even signed autographs. There are stories of kids pulling up to middle school in limousines, young teens going downtown and buying suites at the Renaissance for weeks at a time, kids hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in their parents' homes, and 15-year-olds going to auto dealerships and buying cars cash right off the lot. The same way that Magic Johnson would influence a generation of early 80s kids to entertain with basketball and ball on the court, is the same way that the Y.B.I. would influence a generation of Detroit kids to entertain in the hood and ball in the streets.
So yes, I idolized Magic, Deion Sanders, Muhammad Ali. But as a youngster in Detroit, I also idolized Young Boys Incorporated.
They were legendary at that very moment. Y.B.I. was the shit.
Y.B.I. meant everything, man. That's what a nigga wanted to be. Them niggas was rich, they were successful, they had all the hoes, they had all the money, all the cars. Who didn't want to be that, man?
Dr. Carl Taylor, who wrote the book Dangerous Society, about growing up in inner city America as a young black boy and the rise of teenage drug gangs, he recalled a situation that he had with Y.B.I. when he was working security at Cobo Hall. And he said during that situation, he noticed one of the guys had a big gold medallion, the shape of the United States, but it only had one diamond in it. And he said he seen that same guy about 9 months later, and that medallion was filled with diamonds. And somebody that he knew had to explain to him the diamonds represent each state that they're strong in, where they getting money. They would give their products standout names to catch customers' attention. They had the Whippersnapper, the Firecracker, the Uchi Khan. Butch Jones even had a heroin brand that he named Checkmate to pay respect for his love of the game of chess. And the money was coming in fast. According to Butch Jones' son, he said he remembers being a kid and his dad coming home at night with big trash bags full of money, and he would help him break it down, and his dad would let him keep all of the small bills. They were getting money in a lot of different places in the city, and if they wanted a block, it was probably gonna be theirs. First, they would call in the wrecking crew and come through with baseball bats, beating down anybody who was on the corner that they wanted, and if that didn't work, they would call up the A-Team, a crew of killers known for putting in work for Butch Jones, and they were led by a young man who was only 16 years old, but he had already grown a reputation in the city for putting the murder game down, and his name was Kurt McGirt.
Let them know who you is, bro.
I'm McGirt, man. The legend of all time.
Y.B.I.'s finest, nigga.
But even though the Y.B.I. had a very violent reputation and was known for murder, not everybody in the city was bowing down. A man named Leroy Gunn and his brothers decided to start their own crew to rival the Y.B.I., and they would call themselves Pony Down. They copied the Y.B.I. blueprint and grew to equal size and power within the city. It's said that they would go into Y.B.I. territory and graffiti "I Pony Down" on the walls as a sign of disrespect. The two gangs would go back and forth in shootouts and fights, and it got so bad that respected Detroit hustler Doc Davis had to step in. Doc Davis had international drug connections, and he was one of the main suppliers for both of the crews. He seen how much they were warring against each other, and he knew that that wasn't gonna bring nothing but heat from law enforcement. He wanted to sit both sides down and explain to them, this isn't about ego or who's the toughest. This game is about money, not murder. They tried to come up with a compromise by doing best bag wins, meaning that different crews can be on the same block, and whoever has the best product, they'll win out, and it ain't no bloodshed or violence behind it. But the bloodshed would continue, and the Y.B.I. would keep looking to expand. They would try to take over the block of a well-known Detroit gangster by the name of Layden "The Beast" Simon. He was running some apartments and he was getting a lot of money. And he said one day the Y.B.I. just showed up over 100 deep and tried to take it over. He said he was surprised by this move because him and Butch Jones, they knew of each other. And he said Butch Jones knew that he wasn't to be played with at all. According to Layden "The Beast" Simon, he had a strong team with him, along with some Mexican homies that he knew, and they would go to war with the Y.B.I. He would later be portrayed in the 50 Cent TV show BMF as the character Lamar Silas, a psychopathic gangster obsessed with maintaining his territory and his place in the Detroit drug game by any means, especially by the means of murder.
Stop the rain when it starts to pour. We can't stop the rain. This crazy motherfucker.
Unfortunately for the Y.B.I., outside threats weren't the only thing that they had to worry about. There were internal beefs brewing between the founding members that would eventually turn deadly. Block Marshall and Raymond Peoples, who were once good friends, started to beef over many things, but it was mainly over a woman. It got so bad for Block that he eventually skipped town. He had too many enemies in Detroit, and it said that the police was looking for him too. Butch Jones wanted absolute power over the Y.B.I., and this would cause division between the leaders of the gang. Wonderful Wayne began to distance himself from Butch Jones, which really upset him because WW had access to top-of-the-line product, and he used to serve Butch Jones's faction of the Y.B.I. But when they fell out, he cut him off. And to add to the tension between the two, Wonderful Wayne would start his own team, the H2O gang, and he would keep expanding, not just Pontiac and Flint, he would take it to Seattle. Then he got with his right-hand man, James Cooper, aka Pep, and they opened up shop in Boston, where they were making between $50,000 and $100,000 a day. WW even bought a product back to Detroit that he named Beantown to pay homage to the moves that he was making in Boston. Butch Jones and Wonderful Wayne would continue to have a back and forth beef, but the violence would escalate because one night, WW and Reginald Chestnut, aka Nut, they were riding down Monterey looking for Butch Jones or anybody in his crew. And as they were driving around, they happened to see Butch Jones' sister Lynette leaving his mom's house, headed to a store on Dexter. According to Nut, they pulled alongside of her as she was walking, and he said, "Hey, what's up, Nut?" And she said, "Hey, what's going on, Nut?" Because she knew him since he was a little kid. She helped to raise him. But then he told her to get in the car, and after she looked confused, he pulled out a gun and said, "Lynette, get your ass in the car." And she just looked at Reggie and said, "You gonna do this to me? I helped raise you." And he had a moment of clarity. He knew that this woman had known him all his life, and he told Wayne to just drive off. But the damage had already been done. He tried to kidnap Butch Jones's sister in front of his mama's house. Reginald Chestnut would be shot by members of Butch Jones's crew behind this attempted kidnapping, although he would survive. But in September of 1982, while walking on the corners of Columbus and Lawton on Detroit's west side, Wonderful Wayne would be murdered, shot multiple times. Word of his death traveled fast. He was a very high-profile member of Young Boys Incorporated, and there was a lot of talking in the streets, but a lot of people felt like they already knew who was responsible for the murder of Wonderful Wayne, and that would be Butch Jones and the A-Team.
I always came with love, I always came where it ain't gonna be no violence. But on the same token, I let a person know, now, I'm coming to you. Now, the next guy that I send, he's not gonna talk. He's gonna be some action. He's gonna bring the drama.
He also had issues with Raymond Peoples, who was his friend, but they fell out over money and who was gonna have power over the Y.B.I. And the back and forth between them and the beefing with crews from around the city would ultimately bring heat from law enforcement. The bloodshed and the murders would ultimately be the demise of the Y.B.I. And when undercover police officer William Green was killed by a member of Young Boys Incorporated during an undercover raid, there was nowhere for them to hide. In December of 1982, the feds came and 41 members of the Y.B.I. would be arrested, including the infamous A-Team, except for Kurt McGirt. He would go on the run and be labeled public enemy #1 as a teenager and have a citywide manhunt put out for him by the Detroit police. Even the mayor of the city would put out statements saying how important it was to catch Kurt McGirt. He would ultimately be captured and sentenced to 25 years in prison for the shooting of Gregory Kendricks and the murder of Joseph Brown. According to Kurt McGirt, he felt like his OGs in the Y.B.I. did him dirty because the lawyer they provided for him, he feels like that's the reason he got all that time, like they set him up for a fall. Raymond Peoples would receive 3 years, and Butch Jones, he would go on the run, but he would turn himself in March of 1983 and be sentenced to 12 years in prison for continuing a criminal enterprise. And it's said that he told on his right-hand man, Sylvester Seal Murray, in order to get a lesser sentence. Butch Jones would continue to run his organization from federal prison through phone calls with his wife, and Raymond Peoples, he would continue to run his faction of the Y.B.I. as well from prison, and the two would continue to beef. From behind bars, Raymond would plan a hostile takeover of Butch's faction of the Y.B.I., and one of the things that he planned was to rob one of Butch's main stash houses. The robbery was a failure, and one of the men that Raymond sent was shot in the act. But instead of calling the police, the men who shot him, they took him down to the basement, a place that Butch and his crew were known for, and they loved to use baseball bats to get the information they needed. But once you went down in the basement, you weren't coming out. Everyone involved with this attempted robbery would lose their lives. And when Raymond Peoples was released from prison in the spring of 1985, his family says that he was trying to make a change and he wanted to leave the streets behind. He had gotten married and he got his real estate license, but his past would ultimately catch up to him. And in August of 1985, as he sat in his car on the west side of Detroit, he was shot multiple times, ending the Y.B.I. heroin generation and introducing the Detroit crack era. People like Big Ed Hansard, the Curry brothers, Demetrius Holloway, Maserati Rick and the infamous Best Friends gang, amongst others, would all be running Detroit for years to come. By 1987, Butch Jones would completely lose his hold on the drug trade in Detroit from behind bars due to new charges being brought against him that he had to fight. So he was in federal prison, just waiting for his next opportunity at freedom. And when he was released in 1992, he proclaimed to be a changed man. He wrote a book about his time as a Y.B.I. boss that he said was a cautionary tale to keep kids away from gangs and drugs, but some people called it a money grab, and they said it was an opportunity for him to brag about his time in the streets. But Butch said that wasn't true, and that he really did want to help young kids in the community. But Butch was back to his old ways. In 1994, he created a new gang where he would be the undisputed boss. He would call his new crew the Dog Pound, and he was the top dog. They were just as ruthless and violent as the Y.B.I. Butch would make hundreds of thousands of dollars a day through his drug operations. He had multiple spots on Monterey and a stronghold on the Willard Motel, and his empire looked unstoppable.
3 different spots where we hooking up at. You know, I'm running through a kid heroin every day, and I'm making more money, man, than the president. I'm really living the American dream. I got 4 or 5 houses in the suburbs. I got every kind of car that you can imagine, you know. So now at this time, I'm really looking at like the government, you know. I can't go to jail.
But drug dealing wasn't the only way that Butch was making his money. He was also getting it through kidnapping other drug dealers. It's a story of a man by the name of Antoine Carruthers, who was kidnapped by Butch Jones in the Dog Pound and held for ransom. He was a well-known drug dealer and a rival to Butch Jones, and they felt like his people would pay a lot of ransom money to get him back. They let him call his girlfriend, and she contacted the police. But when negotiations fell through, Antoine Carruthers was shot 3 times in the face. But all of the murders and the bodies would catch up to Butch because in 2001, the feds would come knocking. And this time, they were looking to give Butch Jones the death penalty. The feds claimed that during his time as a boss of the Y.B.I. and of the Dog Pound, that Butch Jones was responsible for over 100 murders. He would eventually turn government informant, giving up his top suppliers for a lesser sentence. And in 2008, he was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Since being locked up, Butch Jones has made numerous attempts to get a compassionate release due to his failing health, him being wheelchair bound, and having multiple medical conditions. But each time, his request has been denied, and he remains in federal prison to this day. He's scheduled to be released in 2027. At that point, he'll be in his 70s. The legendary times of Young Boys Inc. in 1980s Detroit are still remembered and talked about to this day, but the devastation and the destruction left behind by the heroin and crack era can still be felt in the city to this day as well too, especially in the black community. Some of the well-known drug dealers of that time have had their stories told on the big screen, from the Chambers Brothers' influence in New Jack City to the 2018 film White Boy Rick and the BMF TV series, all giving a small glimpse into the 1980s Detroit underworld. And that's the story of Butch Jones and the Y.B.I. Young Boys Inc.